Motion be agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.
I call Carol Beaumont.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising to support the Credit Contracts and Financial Services Law Reform Bill in its second reading. This is a substantial bill and it covers across the consumer credit area, and certainly, as the Minister has said, there are many very positive provisions in this bill. For many of us, and those listening, I'm sure, the impact on fringe lending or predatory lending as part of consumer credit is the area we are particularly interested in. And I just want to look at what that problem is, because actually it is a weeping sore. And just in the last month or so, there have been reports in the media from budget services all around New Zealand of examples of 100% interest rates, of 50% interest rates, of 50% for a loan of 7 days. These are just a few examples that I've recently looked at. This is a real problem. People know, I'm sure virtually every MP in this House knows about the shonky business model of the so-called truck shops that rattle round in low-income parts of our communities. So we know there is a problem, it is an ongoing one. But it's got worse. In tough economic times, then the problem has got a lot worse. These lenders, these predatory lenders, have preyed on vulnerable consumers, they've preyed on families who are struggling to make ends meet. And there's been an increasing problem of the type of predatory lender that's been in the market. So over recent years we've seen an explosion, for example, of payday lenders, short-term, smaller loans, supposedly from one pay period to another, but often longer than that, and loans by texting, things like that. So there's been an increasing problem from new players. Budget services say that the level of indebtedness that they see in our communities has increased. The overwhelming majority of people that go into budget services are tied up in high-interest consumer debt, and that many of the budget services have seen a change in the ratios. So the proportion of people they see who are in the paid workforce has increased as well. Families are damaged by these lenders. Families are damaged as they try and repay excessive interest rates, and many of them actually repay those loans with those excessive interest rates. So that's just taking money that they can ill afford to lose out of their children's pockets or mouths, feeding and clothing their children. And so it's been irresponsible not to have acted sooner when we know this problem, where we can see these problems. And I know the level of concern in the community is very, very high. Now, this has been a long time coming, this particular bill. There was already a review of consumer credit laws underway when National came into government. It started in 2007 with a financial summit held in South Auckland. And that was in response to concerns about the adequacy of the current legislation, the CCCFA, particularly in response to its adequacy in dealing with predatory loan sharks who were starting to be seen as an increasing problem. The deprioritisation of that work, of reviewing that legislation, is shameful. The delays, despite the rhetoric across the House of getting tough on loan sharks, has just been truly shameful. How many thousands of families have been caused immeasurable grief and hardship as a consequence of exploitation and predatory behaviour that has been increasingly evident right across New Zealand, but especially evident in low-income areas. Loan sharks, truck shops, payday lenders have flourished in the environment of low and static wages, ever-rising prices and high unemployment. This is not the rock-star economy that the Prime Minister brags about. I want to talk about interest rate caps. The Minister has referred to them in his speech. How many members of this House think interest rates of 80%, 100%, 200%, 700% are acceptable? How many of you think that's acceptable? How many of those listening to this debate think that those sort of rates are a fair go? If we went and surveyed New Zealanders, how many of those people do you think would think it's okay? Well, I don't think too many. So why are such rates legal? And why are we not addressing those rates in this bill? While Labor welcomes many parts of the Credit Contracts and Financial Services Law Reform Bill, as it is a positive step to further protect consumers, we are outraged that National has once again rejected interest rate caps. New Zealand is now one of the last remaining countries that have not capped rates in an effort to curb unscrupulous rates of interest. Many of those paying such interest rates can ill afford to lose that money from their impossibly tight family budgets. Many, as I said, repay those rates, but at what cost? At the cost to food, at the cost to clothing and other essentials for their family. And many get caught in a cycle of debt and despair, which has huge costs for that whole family. Many are vulnerable families living in our poorest communities. On the 1st of July last year, Australian legislation came into force, capping rates at 48% right across Australia. A bill was introduced into the US Senate in April 2013, proposing an interest rate cap of 36% right across the United States. More than 80% of the individual states in the United States already had interest rate restrictions. Britain was one of the last European jurisdictions to decide to implement loan shark interest rate caps. They'd explored every avenue in an attempt to avoid caps, but just before Christmas, Prime Minister Cameron and Chancellor George Osborne did a U-turn, after previously denouncing interest rate caps, and announced that every avenue had been explored and there was simply no alternative to interest rate restrictions. In addition to the above, interest rate restrictions now apply in Japan, Singapore, most countries in Africa and Europe, Canada, Mexico and almost all of South America. This list is by no means exhaustive. So the same old tired arguments, and the Minister had them just before, were trotted out during considering this bill. Unintended consequences. The caps become a target. Access to credit from loan sharks may be reduced or driven underground. What was not adequately answered for Labor was why would this be a problem here in New Zealand, but not in the many jurisdictions around the world that have introduced interest rate caps? If the government's concerns have any substance, then New Zealand would not stand out as one of the last remaining countries not to have imposed interest rate caps. I personally challenge Minister Craig Foss to find a country that's recently repealed such provisions because they've proved unworkable. Canada has had them for 8 years. If they had all those consequences, why have they not repealed that legislation? So we're not going to sit back and leave this unchallenged. We will be putting forward amendments to this bill to include interest rate caps and also to ensure that the oppression provisions can be used to look at interest rates. And I'm pleased to say that when we introduce those, we have clear indications of support from the Greens, New Zealand First, Mana, Brendan Horan and the Māori Party. Peter Dunn is the man who we need to get across the line, everybody. To those listening, Peter Dunn is the man we need to get across the line. He supported interest rate caps when he voted for my members' bill in 2010. What stops him doing it now? He said at the time he was deeply disappointed. What stops him, in my opinion, is his need for the National Party's support, and it outweighs anything else for that man. So I urge everybody to talk to Peter Dunn. Let them know what you think he should do. Going back to the rest of the bill contains many positive provisions, as I've already said. Many of them have been provisions that budget services have put forward years ago. And CABs in the review Labor commenced 7 years ago. I want to acknowledge the work of those people. They deal with the consequences of this every single day. My members' bill also provided for responsible lending provisions in 2010. And I'm pleased to see that we have responsible lending provisions, albeit 4 years later, in this legislation. Another thing I'm very pleased to see is responsible lending provisions apply to guarantors. I think that's great. I think that's particularly good for all those elderly people who end up guaranteeing loans for their children and their grandchildren. Truck shops, as I've mentioned, they will be covered by some of the provisions. And I want to acknowledge my colleague Chris Farfoy, Chris and I also worked very hard on the Select Committee to try and ensure that truck shops were covered by those provisions.
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member. Her time has expired.
Thank you.
I call Jonathan Young.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to stand and speak in the second reading.